Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 542 for the 27th of Iyar in a regular year. So we all know, or hopefully we all know, the very important rule not to look directly at the sun, right? Many of us wear sunglasses even when we're just walking down the street and the sun's rays are too strong. And so we all know that looking directly at the sun can be very, very dangerous. And I think that this is interesting in the sense that Chassidus, as we'll see, tends to use the analogy of the sun a lot in terms of our relationship with God. So what we're going to be learning about today is we're going to be continuing along the lines of what we've been learning so far in the past few episodes, and especially the one yesterday, about the idea of the Shechina, about the source of all of the vitality here in this world. And we've already made a parallel to the Shechina with the sun yesterday, and so you can go back and listen to that if you haven't already, where we talked about how just like the Shechina is the origin of all the vitality in the world, the sun is the origin of all the light in the world. And we've talked about how any sunlight that we see is merely just a very small radiance in comparison to the light of the sun itself. Like it's totally incomparable. When we just see like a ray of sunlight, it's like nothing in comparison to the sun itself. And similarly too, any vitality that we experience here is merely just a ray of the true source, the true essence of the vitality, the source of vitality. And so what we'll learn about today is that not only can we not look directly at the sun, which is something we all know, but also something else that, if you think about it, is that any sunlight ray, any ray of sunlight, if you were to shine it back into the sun itself, it would cease to exist. So the only way that we can actually experience sunlight, experience the light that comes from the sun, is when there's vessels, when there's things, we call them levushim, like clothing that this sunlight can vest itself in, that can contain itself within. And so we'll say that similarly too, when it comes to the Shechina, which we said is the source of all the life in the world, we can't experience the Shechina directly because that would be too much for us. It would be too powerful. It would be too overwhelming, and we'd actually lose our independent existence, God forbid. So in order for the Shechina to be experienced by us, it too needs to be clothed in vessels. It needs to be clothed in these vestments. These garments, which, as we'll learn, are none other than the will and wisdom of God, which translates to mean Torah, right? And the mitzvahs, which is how we're able to experience godliness here in this world in a grounded way, which allows us to still stay in existence. So let's get into the text and see how the Alter Rebbe breaks all of this down. One side note before we get there is that I wanted to point out that I think it's interesting also that the sun is often used as such an apt analogy for all of this, because the sun also is responsible, even though it's not the source of our lives, it really is responsible for so much of our life on earth in terms of plant growth, in terms of our growth, in terms of our life, our temperature. So many things really go back to the sun. So I think it's interesting that we have this live living metaphor that we can use here in our world that can help us kind of give a sense of God, of our relationship with God. So here we go. So we are in the middle of chapter 52 of Likkutei Amarim. And so the Alter Rebbe, again, he's been talking about the Shechina. He's been talking about this. We talked at the queen yesterday. We talked about the Shechina as being like the mother of all the children. We talked about it as being the Knesset Yisrael, like the origin of all the souls of the Jewish people. So this Shechina, which is the beginning of the revelation and the mainstay of the revelation, this is where God, this is like this origin of where God reveals himself to all of the worlds in a way of revelation. And it's the source of all of the influx of vitality that's found in all of the worlds. And then the Alter Rebbe says in brackets that all of the vitality that we experience, that these different worlds experience, is just like a very small light that draws out of it. Like, just like the ray that radiates out of the sun. That just like when you have a ray that comes out of the sun, it's very small, it's very minute compared to the sun itself. Similarly, too, is the vitality that we experience here in this world is just like a small ray of like the actual vitality, the source of the vitality, where it's coming from. And so the world cannot handle to receive this light of the Shechina so that it will dwell and vest itself within them without a garment, without a levush, it's called in Hebrew, that hides and conceals its light so that they will not become nullified in their source completely, like the way that the light of the sun becomes nullified in its source in the sun. Where like if it were possible to look inside the sun, you wouldn't see that individual ray of sun. You wouldn't see, like, if we went back into the sun itself, it's not like you're going to see like a whole bunch of different rays of sunlight that shine down into the world. All you're going to see is the body of the sun itself. So the Alter Rebbe says, what type of garment could hide this and enclose this Shechina so that it won't become nullified in its light? So what is it? So the garment is the will and wisdom of God, as they are enclosed in Torah and mitzvahs that are revealed to us and to our children. Because we know that the Torah emerges out from Hashem's chokhmah, from Hashem's wisdom. And this chokhmah comes from the supernal world, which is high, way above the Alma Desgalia. Alma Desgalia is the revealed world, which, if you remember, if you're taking notes from a few episodes ago, that's another term for the Shechina. As we say, De'iu Hakim v'lo b'chokhmah yedia chulei, which translates to mean he is the wise one, but without a wisdom that is knowable. So let's just take a pause here and try to understand that for a second. So basically what the Alter Rebbe is saying is that we have a problem here because the Shechina is too much. It's too overwhelming. It's like the sun. So if we want the Shechina to influence the world and send radiance into the world, it needs some kind of garment. It needs some kind of filter. And so what is the garment? What is the filter by which the Shechina can come into this world and fill up the entire world? This is the garment of Hashem's Torah and mitzvahs, through which he encloses his will and wisdom. And the Alter Rebbe says that the way that this happens and the reason why this will and wisdom, as manifest through the Torah, and is able to serve as this proper garment, is because it comes from such a high place. Is because it comes from actually a much higher place than the Shechina itself. So while the Shechina comes from this world called Alma Desgalia, or it's synonymous with the world of Alma Desgalia, the revealed world, God's Torah and wisdom comes from a very supernal world, a world that's much, much higher, a place of Chokhmah, which is actually unified with God himself. So I'm going to just insert my own thoughts here. This is not what's written in the Tanya itself, but this is just the way that I understand this in terms of going back to that analogy of the soul and the body, which I think is a way to make this a little bit more personal, a little bit more understandable, is again, so we think about the brain. So it's interesting, even in psychology, there's this idea of consciousness. So there's this idea of a realization that there's a difference between the brain and the mind. They're not synonymous. They're somewhat different. So I remember learning about this at McGill, like just there's a whole study in psychology of consciousness. What is consciousness? What makes consciousness? And so just in terms of my understanding here and how I'm relating it to this, how do we get the brain to actually influence the body? How do we get this like really obscure substance, like this like gooey gray matter, to actually have an effect on the body? We need something higher than the brain to do that. What is higher than the brain? Higher than the brain is consciousness. Consciousness is not in the brain. Consciousness is something outside and above the brain. And the consciousness is our will and wisdom. Just like God lahavdil, so to speak, has his own will and wisdom. We have will and wisdom. And this consciousness is the missing ingredient that allows us to actually come and have our brain and dictate to our brain what it needs to do. And it gives our brain something to be vested within in order for it then to affect the body and to be present in the body. And so now let's get back to the text. So the Alter Rebbe here is really emphasizing the point that the light of the Ein Sof Baruch Hu is vested and unified with this supernal wisdom. And he and his wisdom are one and the same. So now there's an implied question here, which is that if we were saying this whole time that the Shechina is so lofty, it's so great, it's like the sun, and then it's like, everything, if we experienced it directly, then everything would expire within its source and we wouldn't be able to have our own existence. So then the obvious question comes up is that, okay, so now we're saying like, okay, but then, so the Shechina becomes vested within God's will and wisdom, which is the Torah, but this God's will and wisdom comes from a higher place than the Shechina. So how would that solve the problem? How would we not then still be nullified in our source, right? And so the answer to that is that Alter Rebbe says that this God's will and wisdom, it descended by way of different levels that obscure it from level to level in this whole hishtalshelus of the worlds, like this chain reaction with the descent of the worlds, until it became vested in physical things, which are the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. So this, again, this goes back to, and this is where the section ends today. So this goes back to this idea of tzimtzum. And I think tzimtzum is really it's such an obscure, it's so essential in Chassidus and it's something we talk about a lot, but it's so obscure. And it's really, I don't think it's something that we can truly, truly understand and truly grasp, honestly. It's like we can learn about it, we can talk about it, we can detail it in a certain way, but ultimately it's very, at least for me, is like beyond my grasp, because we're saying basically that there's God who is everything and everywhere, and there's nothing devoid of him, but somehow he did this miraculous thing where he concealed himself. And so this miraculous thing, this tzimtzum that happened, that went, and here we're talking about it in terms of the chain of events by which he took his will and wisdom and he progressively hid it from the world through each level, one by one by one. That's what made it palatable to us. That's what allowed this Torah, his will and wisdom, to become an apt garment for the Shechina. So in sum, just to kind of bring this all together. So again, so it's like we are trying to talk about how it is that God's vitality is here in the world. And we learned that God's vitality here in the world, it goes through a channel, which is known as the Shechina, the divine indwelling. And that Shechina is the beginning of this revelation of God here in the world, of God's vitality. However, the Shechina is very bright. It's very intense. And in order for this to happen, for us to experience this Shechina and receive this vitality, it needs filters. It needs garments that it will pass through. And what are the garments? The garments are God's will and wisdom, which come from a higher source than the Shechina itself. So thus, it's able to assist the Shechina because it does come from a higher place, and vested within and is manifest within the Torah and mitzvahs that we know. And then the reason why that these Torah and mitzvahs are able to serve as garments for the Shechina and not just have the same issue of just being too lofty and that we would expire within them is because this will and wisdom, as it's enclosed within the Torah and mitzvahs, comes down, I should say, through a chain reaction of concealment and tzimtzum, through a whole chain of descent until it comes and becomes manifest in our world. So that is it for today. I hope that was somewhat comprehensible. Again, I know it is really a lot and kind of abstract, but we're going to try to learn this together to the best of our abilities, and we'll continue along these lines tomorrow, and I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shechina. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.